All right, finishing up Chapter 6, Human Body. This is the second edition, about halfway through right now. So let's try to get it done here quickly. Blood composition. So there's three different components of the blood that we need to be aware of at the EMT1 level. We have the platelets, we have the red blood cells, and we have the white blood cells. You will not hear, usually on the National Registry test or even some of our final tests, red blood cells. You'll hear erythrocytes versus leukocytes. Platelets. So platelets are tiny little disc-shaped components that are used for clotting. So if you have a cut, the platelets sort of go to that particular area. They're carried there by the blood. They're part of the blood, and those platelets all bind together, and they sort of clot that up. We talk about platelets quite a bit when we get to cardiology because we have medications that do just the opposite and make the platelets slippery, which allows blood to pass through into the heart if we're having some chest pain. But we'll talk about that come cardiology. Red blood cells carry the hemoglobin and are responsible for carrying the oxygen around our body. And then the white blood cells play a role in our immune system, and they actually help go fight infections. So if you have an elevated white blood cell count when they do tests on you, that usually means that your body's creating additional white blood cells to fight some type of infection inside your body. But for EMT1, platelets, red blood cells, white blood cells. If you want to be prepared for a final exam, extra credit, know how to spell erythrocytes and leukocytes. Different 5 functions of the blood. So number 1 is perfusion. So the blood has to, carry the oxygen around, transporting the oxygen, perfuse the oxygen throughout the system. Perfusion takes place with 2 different things, meaning oxygen and carbon dioxide. So blood is responsible for carrying that oxygen, but also carrying that carbon dioxide. It also picks up the waste and the nutrients and moves that around our body as well. And then the last thing that we just got done talking about in the previous slide with the platelets is the clotting, coagulation. So 5 different functions, great flashcards. Circulatory system. So let's talk about blood pressure. We'll do this quite a bit when we get to vital signs, but blood pressure is the pressure that is exerted on the outside walls of the arteries and the veins as it passes through them. Blood pressures are a number over another number. The top number is the systolic number. The bottom number is the diastolic number. The systolic number is the pressure exerted on the veins and the arteries while the heart is contracting. So as that heart is, left ventricle is contracting, it's actually forcing blood through, and that forcing of blood through with that contraction increases the pressure exerted on the outside walls of the arteries and the veins. And then as that left ventricle retracts and refills with blood, all that blood throughout our system stops moving. So it's actually a pulsating feeling of the blood going through arteries and veins, hence the word pulse. You can feel that with your pulse. Each beat you feel is your left ventricle firing and pushing blood through. So the systolic portion is the active portion of it when blood is moving. The diastolic portion is the inactive portion when left ventricle is refilling. Most of our treatments are going to be done on the systolic side of the house at this level. The nervous system. So you have the sympathetic nervous system and you have the parasympathetic nervous system. Sort of the flight or fight response is the sympathetic nervous system, and we're going to talk about that here briefly in the next couple slides. Let's just go right to those slides for you. So, when the sympathetic nervous system, when the fight or flight response is activated, our pupils dilate. Compared to when our parasympathetic nervous system is activated, that calming portion of it, our eyes will contract. You can see our heart rate increases with the parasympathetic. Heart increases with sympathetic and decreases with parasympathetic. Our stomach inhibits digestion with the sympathetic. Our liver stimulates and creates glucose, but it also releases the glucose that it has. The bladder relaxes, and it can cause an erection or increase blood in a male. So having an idea of what sort of happens with this stuff is important. Let's see, what else do we want to talk about here? Let's talk about these receptors. So alpha receptors are found in the blood vessels and stimulate our veins and our arteries to either contract or dilate. So as we start releasing alpha adrenergic receptors in the sympathetic nervous system, our blood pressure increases because our vessels constrict. So if I'm doing flashcards, I'm doing alpha receptors, blood pressure increases, vessels constrict. The beta adrenergic receptors are found in the heart and the lungs, and it tells our heart rate to increase, but it also tells not only to beat faster, but to beat with more contractility, beat with more force. And the last one is the beta 2 receptors. Those are found in the bronchi of our lungs, and it allows our bronchi to dilate and allow more air to come in. So as our sympathetic nervous system is kicked in, we are constricting our arteries, we are increasing our heart rate and telling our heart to beat with more contractility, and we're telling our lungs to dilate and allow more air in, which sort of makes sense. If you're an athlete or if you're ever in a very high stress situation, it would make sense that our heart rate would increase, we would want our body to pump more blood and receive more oxygen. Let's see here. The nervous system, most complex organ of the body, okay. The two major portions of our nervous system are our brain and our spinal cord. It has thousands and thousands of nerves. So if you think you have your brain here, you have your spinal cord, and you have all these little nerves that are coming off of it, that's the most complex part of our body. Additional nervous systems, we have the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. The somatic nervous system regulates our voluntary movements, talking, writing, walking, all the stuff like that. So moving our body because we tell our body to move. Our autonomic nervous system is all the things that we cannot control. So we cannot just sit here and think and make our vessels dilate. We cannot sit here and think and make our heart rate increase. We cannot sit here and think and make our digestive system accelerate. Those are all functions of the autonomic nervous system. Central nervous system, so we have our brain into three different sections of our brain. We have our cerebrum, which is the large gray matter that most people are familiar with. We have the cerebellum, which is it sits in the back here. It's often referred to as the little brain. And then you have actually the brain stem itself. The term the little brain is a very common type of test question. Knowing that the cerebrum is the largest part of the brain, has 4 different lobes. Each lobe sort of handles a different part of our movement, if you will. The cerebellum, the little brain, controls our body movements and sort of protected down below. And inside our brain stem then is where we have our CSF, or cerebral spinal fluid. That filters out a lot of our impurities and toxins. It also gives us a little bit of cushioning around our brain, so if we do take a shot to the head or the spinal column, this CSF is there to help minimize that impact, if you will. We will talk in trauma about CSF and how CSF can come out of our ears of our patients, and that is a telltale sign of some type of skull fracture. There's the brain stem and the brain itself, the skull, are an enclosed structure, so we should never see cerebral spinal fluid coming out of someone's ears. If we do, that's a telltale sign that they have some type of brain fracture and need our help in a big way. What else we have here? I think we talked about this for the most part. Okay, the skin. So 3 layers of the skin. We have the epidermis on the very top, which is what we can see. We have the dermis, which is the largest portion of it, which contains all of our nerve endings. And we have the subcutaneous, or the fatty tissue underneath. Understanding these 3 layers is sort of important, and the individual functions of them. The fatty layer is sort of the insulator. That's what sort of helps us stay warm and cool us off. The sweat glands and such, and the hair endings are generated in the dermis. And then the epidermis is the outermost layer. It's watertight. It's supposed to protect us. Nothing in, nothing out. It's sort of our outer covering of our skin, if you will. Here's sort of a funky picture. You can see the epidermis is very thin. We're trying to show a picture of the dermis here, and then we get down to that yellowish, clumpy cauliflower stuff, which is the actual subcutaneous fat. And if you look all the way down here, you can see some muscle down below. So sort of a cool picture, I guess. Digestive system in quadrants. So we take the stomach and we divide it into the upper right and upper left quadrant, lower right and lower left quadrant. But to have an idea of what's behind those quadrants is important. So if someone takes a stab or a shot or a baseball bat to the gut, or you just got a medical patient that calls you with lower right quadrant pain, you can, through your EMT studies, go, okay, well, it could be some small intestine, but it's likely appendicitis. I actually diagnosed my own appendicitis several years ago, having lower right quadrant pain, going, God, it can't be the liver, it can't be my spleen, it's got to be that appendicitis. Went in, sure enough, I had appendicitis, and they take it out. So memorizing these things and have an idea that the stomach is upper left, the liver is upper right. So any type of injury to the upper right is very common to have massive blood loss because the liver is very vascular. Important stuff. Here's just a different look at the whole entire thing again. You will see this on a test where we're going to have the quadrants divided into the 4 different quadrants and maybe have a list of these things, and you're going to sort of plug in which quadrant that they're found in. Different parts of the digestive system from there then. The esophagus is obviously the tube that connects from our mouth down to our stomach and moves food in a vascular, sort of a pulsating way. It's not a hard structure, it's a soft structure. You can certainly get things caught in there, but it's difficult to do that because it's a fairly elastic tube, whereas our trachea, our windpipe, is not an elastic tube. Our stomach is where we break down all the chemicals, break down the food, and start turning it into usefulness to us. The small intestine is where most of the breakdown takes place. Major absorption of water and fats and proteins. So a lot of the small intestine is sort of where we're taking stuff out of the food that our body needs and allowing the rest of it to pass. By the time we get down into the larger intestine, a lot of those fats, proteins, carbs, and stuff like that has been taken out, and it's the waste that's left over, and that's how it turns into fecal matter and so on and so forth. The liver is the largest solid organ. It's easily injured because it's such a large organ and requires so much blood loss if you do have some type of injury to it. Stores sugars and filters toxins. If you've ever been out drinking and have a hangover the next day, your liver is part of the body that is not liking you very well. Long-term abuse of that can add up over time. The pancreas is another solid organ. It's fairly deep into our cavity, so it's not usually injured. It produces pancreatic juice, which aids in digestion, and it produces insulin and glucagon. So if we have someone of a diabetic patient nature, they often will have problems with their pancreas, which causes them to be a diabetic. We're going to talk more about hollow and solid organs when we get to trauma, so I'm going to skip over that. So this would be a pretty common thing that you would see on a test in EMT1 with a list of bones for you to go through and list what these different bones are. So going all the way back to part 1 of here, we talked about this already, right? The endocrine system, we don't hit on this too much in EMT1 for the most part. There's a little bit in your book, but we're not going to spend a ton of time on it just because it's more of an EMT2 thing. But just having an idea of the endocrine system and what its uses are is probably decent. Same with the urinary system, more of an EMT2 thing. It consists of the kidneys and the ureters, the bladder, and the urethra. If we're going to have a patient at this level that we're going to treat, we're probably looking at someone of a kidney stone type of nature. And, it's a different chapter, but I'll just mention it here briefly. When we have students who take the National Registry, one of the most common feedbacks we get from them is the terminology and the language. And I think back to, often us EMT instructors will go take the National Registry exam every couple of years just to sort of refresh our memory to help prepare you for the type of questions you're going to see on it. And the last test I took, I remember it was calculi, is what they kept referring to calculi and I guess I pronounce it calculus, although I know I'm mispronouncing that. And I'm thinking to myself, and I'm taking a test, I'm like, God, I'm pretty sure they're talking about kidney stones, but it's the Latin word for kidney stones. So understanding those different terminologies, and there's tons of good Quizlets out there that talk about the terminologies. That's going to be really important as you approach the end of EMT2 to be successful in the National Registry exam. However, off topic here, right? So kidney stones are something we'll deal with. There's going to be that dull, constant, just bad pain in the rear flank of their body. There's not a whole lot we can do for them other than manage their pain. They probably know that they already have them. If not, it can be very painful. But there's not for as far as EMTs go, there's not too much we can do for them other than encourage them to drink a lot of water. They talk about the difference between the female and the male reproduction system here. We'll hit the female side of this quite a bit when we get into pregnancy and childbirth, because there's so many different things that can go wrong with ectopic pregnancies and just a variety of different stuff along those lines. For the most part, if we're going to be dealing with something with a male, it's going to probably be trauma related, which are always very awkward and we'll just call them interesting, if you will. Females are a little bit different because when you have pregnancies and you have menstrual cycles and you have ectopic pregnancies and on, that can be all over the board for the females. So, all right, moving on. Ventilation. So we're going to talk about the difference between ventilation, respiration, and oxygenation and sort of what the problems are. So someone who is having a problem with their ventilation, how can that be? Well, the inability to exhale effectively or inhale effectively, some type of obstruction. If I take a golf ball and shove it down your throat, you're going to have a ventilation problem. You can't move air in and out. Remember, ventilation is the process of moving air in and out. If you damage your spinal cord enough that the signals from your brain telling your lungs to work are no longer connected, you have a ventilation problem. You could have an overdose. We have tons of people that have the heroin overdoses, and that suppresses their respiratory drive. It's a ventilation problem. They're not moving air in and out of their body, period. Loss of consciousness, or just a weak respiratory drive. They're just so weak that their diaphragm and their intercostal muscles no longer have enough energy to push air in and out. So if we have people that have a ventilation problem, we're going to see erratic breathing patterns, so there's not going to be normal rate and depth. We're going to see increased CO2 levels, and we'll talk about end-tidal CO2 readings when we get to the ventilation portion of it. We'll see decreased oxygen levels on our SpO2, which is a later sign. And then eventually we're going to start seeing initially increased heart rate, then it's going to become a lower heart rate, and eventually they're just going to die. So we have to move air in and out, right? So if they have a blocked airway, we're going to clear it. If we have a swelling in the airway, we have to somehow maintain that airway or establish an airway. If they have a trauma to their mouth, neck, or chest wall, we have to mitigate that and make sure we have air moving in. It could be something as simple as they've vomited a bunch of material and that's blocking the airway, so we can suction it out or help them with that. Overdose. Really, you're going to deal with a lot of overdoses in your career. Drugs are a problem. An asthmatic patient, someone whose lungs, their bronchioles have squeezed down so tight that they just can't allow air to get down to the alveoli anymore. Again, ventilation problem. So then we move to the respiration problem. So respiration, remember, is air is moving in and out. We're just not able to have that process, that exchange at the alveoli level. So we could have fluid buildup in the alveoli with pulmonary edema, which is can be a lot of different things, but often congestive heart failure, which we'll talk about in cardiology class. But basically, the air is getting down to the alveoli. It's just not passing across that membrane. The oxygen is not being dropped off, and the CO2 is not picking up. Oxygen air is going in and out. It's just not doing what it's supposed to do. That could be because of the mucus that's built up in there as well. Talked about pulmonary edema. So the effect of all this is buildup of waste, buildup of CO2, lack of oxygen, and eventually people are going to become have very difficulty breathing, altered LOC, and then again death. So how do we figure this out? How do we fix these people? We need to reopen up that passageway and get that oxygen down to the alveoli level, and oftentimes at the EMT level, at least, we'll oftentimes do that with some type of CPAP, which, again, we'll talk about in ventilation. All right. Oxygenation is, so we're moving the air in and out. There is there's not the mucus that the oxygen is getting down to the alveoli level. It's just not attaching to the hemoglobin. It's not moving throughout the body. So why is that? Well, it can be because there's the air that's getting down to the alveoli level doesn't have oxygen in it. Maybe you're in an oxygen-deprived environment. You're breathing air in and out, and the alveoli are wide open. There's just not enough oxygen in the air that's getting down to the alveoli. Or you have a carbon dioxide or a carbon monoxide situation where it's not allowing it to bind to the hemoglobin. Either way, we need to reverse that as well. So, okay, shock. Okay, we're going to do a huge section on shock. I have a very lengthy, what I consider to be very good Glass Studio presentation on shock. I'll sort of hit the high points here for you because we only got a couple more slides left. You have compensated shock, you have decompensated shock, and then you have irreversible shock. Compensated shock means that your body does not have enough oxygen or enough fluid in it to, your body needs more. But your body's able to compensate. So if you lose some blood on the ground, for example, your veins are going to constrict, and it's still going to have enough blood to push around through your body and perfuse the rest of your body. It's compensating. Your heart rate's going to increase. Your respiratory rate's going to increase. Your veins are going to contract. All these things happen simultaneously to keep blood moving through your body because it's compensating. Eventually, you're going to get a point, if you haven't fixed the stem root of the problem, that you can't breathe any faster. You can't. Your heart rate can't beat any faster, and your veins can't constrict anymore. So now you're sitting in a decompensated shock. Decompensated, the clear difference between compensated shock and decompensated shock is your blood pressure starts to drop. Compensated shock, your heart rate goes up, your respiratory rate goes up, but your blood pressure still maintains a reasonable outcome. Decompensated shock is when your blood pressure starts to drop because all those things can't make up for it anymore. And then the last one that's not in here is irreversible shock. That's when you've been in decompensated shock so long that your tissues have actually died. And even if you establish a blood flow to them at this point in time, they're already dead and they won't take that oxygen anymore. So that those are dead tissues that are sort of being written off, I guess. So why does it happen? There's three main characteristics that happen. You can have a pump problem, which means your heart is not pushing the oxygen and the blood around your body well enough. You can have a vessel problem, which means there's plenty of oxygen and blood in your system, but your veins are so large and dilated that you can't maintain your blood pressure. Or you can have a fluid problem, which means your heart's beating fine, your veins have constricted and made them as small as possible. You just literally have bled out so much that you don't have enough fluid left in your system. And again, we'll talk about those in length as we come here. Here's the different types of shock. I'll hit on them real quick. So hypovolemic shock is the lack of blood, meaning you have taken blood and put it out of your body onto the ground, or you're incredibly dehydrated because you haven't been eating your fluids and you've been peeing and vomiting and having diarrhea, so you just are super dehydrated. Cardiogenic shock is your heart is not beating well enough. So yes, you have blood. You're not bleeding anywhere. You have plenty of blood in your system, and you have plenty of oxygen in your system. Your heart is just not beating effectively enough to push that blood around your body. Obstructive shock means something in your body is blocking the blood flow. So if you put like a tourniquet on your leg, on your thigh, I guess that'd be one way of explaining what obstructive shock would be. All your tissues distal to that tourniquet would be shocky, lack of perfusion because it's been obstructed. Anaphylactic shock is the big one. That's with some type of over-exaggerated immune response. So a bee sting, allergy to nuts, shellfish, things along those lines. It's probably the one thing as EMTs that we can really make a strong difference with by administering an epi shot. So the blood vessels uncharacteristically and wrongly over-exaggerate, dilate, so they get very, very big. And at the same time, your lungs, your bronchioles in your lungs constrict like an asthma attack, and those two things together can kill you in a matter of seconds. So your heart rate's beating faster, but there's not enough oxygen coming in because your lungs have constricted. But even though your heart's beating faster, your veins are so big that it's not pushing blood around, and it happens very, very quickly. We'll talk more about that later. Septic shock is just an infection in your body. The infection wrongly tells your veins and arteries to dilate to a portion, that cannot push blood around. And then neurogenic shock is some type of injury to your spinal column. So your brain's telling your heart to beat and your brain's telling your lungs to breathe, but the spinal column, the messages have been shut off and the messages are no longer getting to the rest of the body. So the rest of your body just goes sort of flaccid, if you will, and you go shocky and eventually going to die. So like a hypovolemic shock would be a fluid problem. If we think back to our pump vessel fluid, hypovolemic is going to be a fluid problem. Cardiogenic is going to be a pump problem. Obstructive shock is probably going to be some type of vessel problem. Anaphylactic shock is also a vessel problem. The vessels get too big, but it also is a portion like about our lungs, like I talked about. Septic shock is a vessel problem, and neurogenic shock is a vessel problem. So we'll talk about those more. I'm almost done, guys. 2 more slides. Hang with me here. I'm trying to get under 30 minutes. You have 2 different types of metabolism. We have aerobic metabolism and anaerobic metabolism. This is a fairly important slide to understand the concept. Aerobic metabolism means that our body is functioning with oxygen. Your body right now, unless you're listening to this while you're out for a run, is probably functioning in an aerobic state with oxygen. Meaning the amount of oxygen your body needs, it has. And if it has the amount of oxygen it needs, the byproduct is CO2, which you're breathing off right now, and water, which you're going to pee off in a little bit. When you start running or exercising, and your body's going, oh boy, I need more oxygen, and your heart rate increases, your respiratory rate increases, it'll eventually switch over where it's going, okay, I don't have enough oxygen, so now I'm going to run off my anaerobic metabolism. And it's using as much oxygen as it can, but it's also using other stores throughout your body for energy. That byproduct is lactic acid, and you've all experienced it. You exercised, you lifted weights, you went for a run, you did some type of physical exertion that your body is not accommodating to, that you don't do on a regular basis, and the next day you're sore. Yep, lactic acid. Lactic acid was used, or your body went to an anaerobic state, and lactic acid was produced, and that lactic acid then binds to your muscles and make your muscles sore the next day. So that's about the best way I can explain it to you as I'm sitting here. And the very last one here, this is sort of a precursor to a test, where this is sort of what you can sort of explain or expect. The liver, so let's just review this real quick. The liver can be found primarily where, if you remember back, it's sort of the upper right quadrant, right? Lower left upper quadrant. Getting this all wrong here. We have our diaphragm that runs along here. We have our stomach, and we also have our spleen that sits here. Our right lower left, our right lower quadrant, all over the place. We have our small intestine, we have our large intestine, but remember this is our appendix. So lower right is really telltale for appendicitis, and we'll talk about that a little bit more and how to diagnose that. And then our lower left quadrant is probably usually all of our intestines, so large and small intestine. A lot of us think our stomach is down here, but our stomach is actually up here in our left upper quadrant. Okay, guys. I think that is about going to do it here. That's Chapter 6, the human body. If you've taken EMP classes in the past, you can recognize that this is sort of a real dumbed down generic portion of that. But we're trying to get you as much information as possible about the human body that is directly applicable to what you're going to be learning moving forward. And if we go too deep into it,